You can fix that. All right. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, I want to thank David Diskin and Freedom and Chris for helping me organize this, and all you guys for coming. Yes, the first time back in 4 years, and this is my first talk since COVID as well. I wrote the book, Darwin's Apple, The Evolutionary Biology of Religion, which, as the title suggests, is about the origins of religion. This talk is about why religion arose in the first place. As for my qualifications, as Freedom said, I have a BA, I'm not a PhD or academic. I've done a great deal of research in the cognitive science of religion, as it's known in academia, which I'm going to refer occasionally by its initials CSR. I have a lot to talk about. Any aspect of religion can be an entire talk about by itself. So to get through this, I'd like you to hold off on questions, as Freedom said, unless it's to clarify something I've said. I expect we'll have a lot to talk about later. The talk is in 2 parts. The first part, I'm going to quickly go through the existing popular explanations for the theory of why humans have religion and why they're all insufficient. Then I present my approach in the second half to analyzing the origin of religion. Along the way, I'm going to poll you for your opinions. For example, how many of you are atheist or agnostic? I expect to see all the hands, yeah. And how many of you are humanists, which are not mutually exclusive, obviously. How many of you consider yourselves skeptics? Yes, excellent. Who thinks religion is an unnecessary feature of human behavior and will go away? Not so many. That's a tough one. How many of you want it to go away? All right, you're not going to like where this is going. All right, so we have a little technical difficulty where I can't see the slide on my laptop, so I'm going to have to do a little neck turning occasionally, but here we go. So in a complex topic like religion, so much depends on the assumptions and the postulates, postulates being propositions that are self-evident or assumed. So I'm going to give you my assumptions and postulates. We're going to use science to understand religion. Seems obvious in this crowd, but of course you know very well that there's a lot of people out there who don't care much for science, at least in certain contexts, and they would rather use the biblical text or others like it for their knowledge. I invoke the science of Darwinian evolution, psychology, and anthropology. I'm assuming you're all okay with evolution, right? Let's see your hands. Is anybody brave enough to say they're not okay with evolution? Excellent, it makes it easy. So I expect you're all familiar with terms like evolutionary fitness, adaptation, and selection. If not, I can clarify a little bit. We can't get into it too much. In evolutionary biology, there are several levels of selection. Some people refer to it as multi-level selection. One level is the gene-level selection, which Richard Dawkins wrote in his first book, The Selfish Gene, in which the gene is the level that selection takes place. Not going to get into it. And then there's group-level selection, in which the whole group is competing essentially against other groups. But the gold standard in biology remains individual level selection. So for our purposes, this talk is about how the individual generates internal religion and how a person experiences religion and why. And that's where we have to look to understand where religion arose. Humans are biological organisms. So religion is a spectrum of human behaviors, emotions, and other neurophysiology. Religion arose tens of thousands of years ago in hunter-gatherer tribes, groups of pre-literate peoples of roughly 25 to 150 individuals using stone technologies. That's the environment in which human religion evolved, not hierarchical societies of city-states or institutional religions of monotheism and their written doctrines, which is what we like to focus on because we don't like them trying to impose themselves on our society. So we have to think a little differently. And there will be more postulates coming along. What are some of the evidence for religion in hunter-gatherers? There is stone carvings. This is the Venus of Willendorf, about 25 to 30,000 years old. thought to be a fertility symbol, or the first pornography, or this, or both. We have cave art, cave drawings, bone flutes. Strongly suggests that there was music in the early hunter-gatherer tribes. Ooh, that is awesome. Thank you.
You can use it more than I could, right?
If you could tilt it back just a tad. Okay, well, while you're working on that. And then another big piece of evidence is burials. Human burials that have provisions in it, or tributes, where they put tools or weapons or food or pets or other plant materials. Why would they do that? The presumption is that these early humans had a sense that when a person dies, that's not the end, that there's something like a soul which exists after death. And so you need to give the dead person these tools or weapons or whatever it is to accompany them to their next life. That is a strong indication that they had a religious sensibility. And the last piece of evidence I want to mention is piles of powdered ochre, this iron-rich rock that they ground up and used as a red pigment, painted ceremonially on the deceased and or on the living for ritual purposes, and there are people still doing that today. And some of those piles of powdered ochre are found in old human habitation sites dating back 100,000 years. Okay, one more little thing. When I use the term consciousness, it refers to human cognition that differentiates us from other animals. I tend to use the terms interchangeably, human cognition and consciousness. So now we're going to talk about the existing cognitive science of religion theories. One of the most basic questions CSR academics debate and disagree on is whether religion is evolutionarily adaptive or is it a non-functional byproduct. There remains disagreement between the religion as adaptive folks and byproduct folks in the CSR community. But there are even shortcomings in religion as adaptation explanations, as we'll see. Scholars acknowledge that the explanations for the development of religion remains contentious. There is nothing close to consensus. I'm going to suggest tonight a new paradigm, or at least I haven't seen anybody suggest this one. How many of you know about as religion as byproduct? Hands, anybody know? Not too many people have heard the story. How many believe religion is a byproduct? Okay, so this is relatively new information for most of you. I have asked Freedom to read for me, but hang on, we're almost there. So some CSR academics claim religion is a byproduct and was never functional. It was a byproduct of other evolved human cognitive developments, like a theory of mind, hyperactive agency detection. You might not have heard of those things. It doesn't really matter. How many of you have read God Delusion? Okay, a few of you, good. Dawkins is famous for his opposition to religion, obviously, we all know that, and claiming that religion is a non-functional byproduct. He's saying there's no purpose to religion. There's no reason for humans to have it. So now, I have asked Freedom to read some quotes from God Delusion. And I hope she has enough light to see it.
I hope so too.
You can, you know, here, you know what I can do is you can give you a light.
Or she can go to the other microphone, which has more light.
Has light. Oh, this is nice. Darwinian selection habitually targets and eliminates waste. Nature is miserly.
Miserly.
Oh, excuse me, miserly. Never heard that word before. Miserly is a miserly accountant. Oh, that makes more sense. Grudging the pennies, watching the clock, punishing the smallest extravagance.
Good job. Get a gold star.
Miserly.
For that. Miserly. All right. So, I mean, that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? At least if you accept evolution, and all of you do, nature is, oh, no, you have to step on. There you go. Yeah. We accept that in the terms of natural selection, how organisms compete to survive and reproduce, that's kind of the basics, the most basic aspect of what evolution is, that those organisms that are most efficient and don't waste energy and resources on things that aren't to their benefit are going to survive preferentially to those that might have features or traits that aren't as efficient, that are potentially wasteful. That's what he's saying. I think that's fine. Would you read the second bookmark highlight?
I can. Religious behavior is, am I skipping that or is that part of it?
You can skip it.
Is time consuming, energy consuming, often as extravagantly ornate as the plumage of a bird of paradise. Plumage.
Plumage.
Sorry, I'm using, I told him I would speak and then all these words.
Well, Dawkins is a bit flowery in his prose at times. So take a look at those two statements. By the way, can you tell me how many pages separate those two quotes?
Yes, it is 191.
One page
One
separates
page.
that.
Yeah.
All right.
That is, huge contradiction from the first quote, isn't it?
You saw it, didn't
Yes,
you?
yeah.
Anybody else see it?
Yeah.
It's contradiction.
It's miserly penny pinching too much.
In his flowery prose, he uses a time metaphor. In the first one, it's watching the clock. In the second, he says religion is time-consuming. Those are contradictory.
Yeah.
And then he uses the word extravagant twice. He says punishing the smallest extravagant. And then he says religion is energy-consuming, often as extravagant. Yeah, you know what it says. Wait a minute. These are saying opposite things in 2 pages from each other. Religion as a non-functional byproduct would not be tolerated by evolution, would it? According to, well, it depends which side of Dawkins you're looking at right there. Okay, now the third one, third and last.
Third and last. The general theory of religion as an accidental byproduct, a misfiring of something useful, is the one I wish to advocate. The details are various, complicated, and disputable.
Thank you, Freedom. The details are various, complicated, and disputable. You know, he's not really selling it that well, is he? In fact, he could not come closer to disavowing his own byproduct proposition without actually disavowing it. Skeptics, I know there's skeptics in this crowd. The breadcrumbs are there. If you read this chapter of God Delusion without the usual worship and veneration that Dawkins usually gets from atheists and humanists and free thinkers, you'll see that he knows he's actually got a weak argument despite trying very hard to be convincing. If you look critically, you'll see he's equivocating and hedging throughout the chapter about religion as byproduct. It's rather shocking, actually, and it's also shocking that people don't catch this. Now, there's way more to talk about religion as byproduct, but we're going to save it for the Q&A if you want. But at least this should be enough to put a little worm in your head that there's a problem here. So now we go to the first postulate. Religion is a biologically adaptive array of evolved behavioral features. It's not a byproduct. The next theory for the origin of religion is about social cohesion and cooperation. And yes, it's very true, religion serves to improve social cohesion and cooperation, probably. And it's probably the most popular adaptive reason to explain religion. But it's not the origin of religion. Do we have any Frans de Waal fans? Does anybody know who Frans de Waal is? Frans de Waal is a primatologist who works out of Atlanta. He's written several books, popular science books, like Primates and Philosophers, How Morality Evolved, and The Bonobo and the Atheist. I'm sorry, I need a drink. I'm getting all hoarse here. Yeah. So, in his books and others by people, other academics who look at this, they describe how morality, empathy, and other social cohesion mechanisms evolved in many animal species long before humans. And there's a lot of science to support that. I postulated that religion originated in hunter-gatherer bands tens of thousands of years ago. Humans have lived in bands and tribes for over 95 to 99% of human existence, and we're more like chimp troops in size than modern human societies. Some claim social cohesion is specifically necessary for cooperative hunting and defense, but chimps hunted game and attacked other chimp troops cooperatively, as Jane Goodall described in her book, In the Shadow of Man. And there's Jane with her chimp at the Gombe. Anybody read that book, the Jane Goodall book? Where she first observed these crazy things that basically chimps warred with each other. They went to war. A band of chimps, of males, went to a neighboring troop and attacked it and killed some of the other chimps. Early genus Homo was making stone tools for at least a couple million years, showing culture, we'll talk more about that, showing pretty advanced cognitive abilities. They used and controlled fire 700 to 800,000 years ago and hunted big game cooperatively long before religion. Early genus Homo already showed sophisticated cooperation long before religion came along. Why did humans need religion to improve social cohesion? There isn't a good reason that's been given that I have seen. Now, there is so much to read out there in the academic literature. I try to stay current as I can. I can't read everything. Maybe we can talk about it later. But that's kind of a critical question. If you're going to say religion is about social cohesion and cooperation, you have to make a case for why humans needed religion at the time they were developing it. And I am unaware of a good argument. There's a lot of arguments about why we needed religion after the agricultural revolution around 11,000 years ago. And then society started getting bigger, and you didn't always know everybody in your group, because now instead of 150 individuals, there's thousands. But that's not when religion started. It started much earlier. So, yeah, okay. Wait a minute, where am I here? Okay, thank you. So, the last thing I want to say about the social cohesion business is that if you accept evolution and you accept that other animals besides humans had social cohesion mechanisms, which they clearly do, and we clearly have many of the same ones, not all of them, but many of them, you have to believe that we inherited those from our primate predecessors. Again, why did we need religion for that function? All right. The last one of the theories for religion is the problem of belief. Is religion about belief in supernatural agents like gods, or asking existential questions, why we die, what's our purpose in life, reasons for earthquakes and hurricanes and volcanoes and all that, where we came from? The creation myths are answers for people to explain where we came from. But they're all just myths. They're all just beliefs. There's no truth value in those beliefs. We don't ask, is this myth true? From our point of view today, we don't say one myth is true and the other isn't. They're all just beliefs. Beliefs are a feature of human cognition. Humans have beliefs about everything. Social beliefs, political beliefs certainly, and even scientific beliefs. Religion is just a special case of belief. Do other animals have cognitive beliefs like humans? Do other animals believe in supernatural beings or ask about their own death far in the future? And the answer is no. And sometimes people raise the issue of the elephants who go back to the boneyards of their deceased ancestors. And that is not religion. Or at least if you're a skeptic, you need way more evidence to say that that would be anything close to religion. So, before asking why humans have religious beliefs, I ask, why do humans have beliefs at all? The relationship between religion and the function of beliefs is not explained by CSR academics. If you embrace Darwinian evolution, you must ask first what happened cognitively to humans that enabled them to develop beliefs in the first place, and what function does that serve? What is the function of beliefs in humans? Answering this question will change the way we see the purpose and function of religious beliefs. I will address the function of beliefs before we get to the end, but I'm going to put it off for now. So that is all I have to say about the existing cognitive theories of religion at this point, but they all have problems. And that's why there's so much debate in the scientific and in the cognitive science of religion community, and no one can agree because they all have issues and they all attack each other on those issues. Now I'm going to wipe the slate clean, and we're going to start the second part of the talk, which is me beginning with the scientific method to use as a way to build a better theory of religion. Most of you are familiar with the scientific method. I'm only going to talk about the first two steps, observation and hypothesis, in today's talk. I already said religion is a spectrum of behaviors. What religious behaviors do we observe? Step one in the scientific method. I'm not going to talk about beliefs. There's no truth in beliefs. It's got to be observation. So we think in terms of hunter-gatherers, 60,000 to 100,000 years ago. Of course, no one here has made direct observations of Paleolithic peoples, but we've seen media, movies, and pictures and things showing religious behavior of hunter-gatherers 100 to 125 years ago, when the anthropologists first spread out around the world to find these hunter-gatherer societies that existed at that time and observed them. And what observations did they make? What did they see? Well, we've seen some examples of religious behavior already in this talk. What we see are the sacred rituals as opposed to the mundane or profane rituals. And quickly, mundane, profane rituals are, we know why we do them. We have meals, we go to work, we go to school. They all have a purpose that we understand, whereas the sacred rituals, most of us in this room would say that if we didn't do the sacred rituals, there would be no consequence. There would be no problem. They're just not necessary. So that's the way to think about the difference. Sacred rituals are the behaviors of religion. Now, like everything about religion, sacred rituals can mean many things. But I'm going to pick 5 of them, and by no means are they the only rituals. There's way more rituals. But I'll show them to you, and then I'm going to explain why I focus on those 5. The first one is music. We saw the bone flute. We know that it's assuredly that if you had music in those days, back in the Paleolithic, you also had drumming, and who knows what other things they had. And there's also a lot of science about music in the brain. I'm not going to talk about that. Dance and other movements. In our modern days, we know about, for instance, the whirling dervishes, who are a Sufi sect of Islam. They spin around and around for a very long time to achieve what they call translated, a physically active meditation, and abandoning one's ego or personal desires. You might have recognized that terminology from other woo. Another example from our current society is drug-fueled raves, in which mostly young people take drugs. Ecstasy is popular, and they dance to electronic music for hours and hours and hours. And guess what? They get altered states of consciousness from this. And we will be talking more about that. Art, we've seen some examples already, the stone carving and the cave paintings, and we'll see some more examples later. Prayer, obviously. I'm not going to say much about it, except from an observer's point of view, you can pretty much tell the supplicating hands, the bowing, the prostration, the Muslims prostrating on the ground, kneeling, the Catholics do that, and God knows what else. The last one I want to mention is mythology. And mythology is a little tricky because I said mythology is about beliefs. And we're not talking about beliefs. But you can observe it happening. And minimally, you can imagine that you have an elder or elders sitting around the fire in the cave or in the hut, transmitting the stories of the people, the creation myths and all the other myths of that culture. But beyond that, it's frequently the case that the myths are transmitted in a more dramatic fashion, where you have actors who put on animal skins or feathers or other adornments, and they embody the characters in the myth and they act it out. That happens in recent times, and I would expect, although I don't have the evidence I'm aware of, to say that it happened in Paleolithic times as well. Things you can observe. That's the first reason that I picked these, because when you have rituals like rites of passage or sacrifice or festivals and ceremonies, well, yeah, they're rituals, but they can mean a lot of different things. When you look at these, you identify them. That's these things that you're looking at. And you can measure them physiologically in various ways, and people do. And the last thing is, they're components of more complex rituals. They're the things that you will see in rites of passage and ceremonies and festivals and those kinds of things. The effects of these rituals are beneficial. It's no coincidence that what were once religious ritual behaviors are now therapeutic practices. Some of you might be familiar with art therapy, music therapy, dance and movement therapy, drama therapies, and there's other versions of these ritual therapies. They all exist. They're practiced throughout the world where you have psychologists and therapeutic practices. There are literally thousands of studies showing therapies like these benefiting human psyche and health. And of course, our favorite psychedelics have always been part of many religious ritual traditions. And many of you are now aware, and it's been in the media quite a lot recently, psychedelics are now showing promise for a variety of psychological issues, right? You've seen those? Yes. Coincidence? Don't think so. We'll talk more about that. So, the next postulate. Sacred rituals are the behaviors of religion as opposed to non-sacred or profane rituals. Okay. Now that we have established these rituals, I'm just going to call them rituals, not religious rituals. Rituals are the behaviors of religion. How does that affect on the brain, our physiology, but mostly about the brain? So I'm going to rely on the work of mostly on Pascal Boyer and Pierre Leonard, or Leonard, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. They're professors of psychology at Washington University in St. Louis. They wrote 3 papers delving into ritual. And they were talking about ritual in general and not specifically religious rituals, but it still applies. And they said, and I'm just going to give you the high points, can't go into all the details about how they got to these conclusions. Rituals swamp working memory, and we'll talk about working memory in a second. Rituals inhibit or suppress unwanted or intrusive thoughts. Intrusive thoughts are temporarily pushed away from awareness consciousness. Rituals can be considered a form of thought suppression. There is a temporary lowering of anxiety levels after the performance of rituals. And this particular one is a fairly popular topic among people who study what ritual does to the person. It's more than the other ones that I've talked about. This is probably the most recognized result of ritual. Religious rituals often result in altered states of consciousness. In modern times, I mentioned the Sufis, whirling dervishes, glossolalia, speaking in tongues. A few of the Christian cults do that. And then, of course, you have your peyote rituals, ayahuasca ceremonies in indigenous Amazonian tribes. And tobacco is another product used actually in a variety of rituals. Obviously, there's the hesitate to say because it seems too corny in a way, the peace pipe among Native Americans. But certainly there's at least one ritual, rite of passage for adolescent boys, where they're really put through the ringer, and the elders make a concoction. It's like a soup of tobacco juice, and they drink it and they get sick. But it also makes them kind of wired. And that's just the least of the problems that these kids have when they put them through these rituals. In any case, does anybody here practice meditation or yoga? Yeah. You know what happens. What do they ask you to do when you meditate or when you practice yoga? What is, just quickly, anybody have a... Clear your mind. Ooh. Don't think about anything. Where did we hear about that just a second ago? Swamp's working memory. These are formerly religious rituals from the Buddhist and Hindu tradition from thousands of years ago, and now have become secular rituals. We'll come back to that. Okay, why would humans need rituals to swamp working memory, inhibit or suppress intrusive thoughts, lower anxiety levels? The next postulate, religious ritual behavior co-evolved with other cognitive changes in biologically modern humans. So given this, we need to look at other cognitive changes that evolved along with religious rituals to see if they are interrelated in any way. I had asked before if animals have cognitive beliefs like humans, or if they needed religion to promote social cohesion. Well, no, they already had their own social cohesion mechanisms. Something is underlying the development of ritual behaviors that have these effects on our consciousness, on our cognition. There has to be a reason, an adaptive benefit, for the strong desire we humans have to engage in and experience ritual. If you believe that evolution punishes the smallest extravagance. And we also saw that these rituals have beneficial effects on humans as well. So, how is human cognition different from other animals? And in this slide, I use mostly the work of Cosmides and Tooby. Anybody know Leda Cosmides and John Tooby? These are evolutionary psychologists at UC Santa Barbara, and they founded an evolutionary psychology department. They've written a lot of great stuff. So, this isn't exactly mind-bending here. Humans evolved the capacity for culture. I think we all know that. It happened partly because we became less reliant on instinct, although not freed from instinct. But it enabled greater flexibility, creativity, and foresight. To be able to, okay, first we're going to say it opens up a world of possibilities and choices by being less reliant on instinct. But it also put a much greater burden on our cognition, that we now have all these choices. So many brain modules are involved in this new human cognition. In our day-to-day activities, our brains get sensory input, long and short-term memories go in, emotional information, all these pieces go together to help us deal with what we're going to do moment to moment. Of course, the frontal lobes are very important. These are the parts of the brain that we think are the most specific to humans, that other animals don't have like we have. And they have a lot of input into what we do moment to moment. The shorthand for where all this happens is working memory. That's where all these different inputs come together and tell us what we're going to do moment to moment. Now, it's a metaphor. There is no part of the brain that I'm aware of, and I don't think neuroscientists are aware of, that there is a working memory area. It's just all these different parts of the brain are talking to each other. The fact is, most all of the activity that goes on in working memory, I should really say all of it, happens in the unconscious. When you decide to do something, or when you start an activity, you don't know what the emotions were. You don't know what the short and long-term memories went into it. You don't know what sensory information came. A small part of what happens in working memory actually gets promoted to your consciousness. But in your consciousness, you, for the most part, do not know why that happened. We'll talk more about that. So, there's a flip side to this very, very quick synopsis of how humans are different than other animals. How is it that our conscious brain enables this flexibility in responsive culture? The way our consciousness and thinking manifests is noisy, persistent, often distracting. We have an inner dialogue or a voice in our head that's talking to us. That voice can be looping and repetitive, especially under stress. People's minds start racing. They can't shut off the internal dialogue sometimes. In some cases, and I know I've experienced this at times, you can have difficulty sleeping. It can cause anxiety, even depression. Some behavioral and developmental disorders like ADHD or OCD can show similar symptoms of a hyperactive mind as part of their manifestation. But many more of us have non-clinical, non-pathological symptoms as well. These things happen to all of us at one time or another. I don't have diagnosed ADHD or OCD, but I have things that I am kind of OCD about. And I even suspect I have little aspects of myself that are kind of ADHD, but I'm not diagnosed. But we all have a little bit of these things, some more than others. It's really an endemic feature of the human mind, these features and traits that we acquired with our consciousness, that also gave us these great skills and tools that enabled this marvelous civilization. These tools that we have, they're fabulous. They're the result of all this wonderful consciousness that we evolved. But then there's also thinking that's self-critical and judgmental and pessimistic. The people who look at this say, well, it's a good defense mechanism, and that's true. You've got to be protective against things that can hurt you. But sometimes these things get way out of control. Our minds are asking, did we make the right decision? Why did I do this instead of this? Why am I such an idiot? We've all had those experiences. Our minds are actually poor at reasoning and poor at recognizing our own feeble decision-making skills. Have you heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect? Anybody? Good. What it says is that people who are low in expertise on a particular topic think they're more knowledgeable than they really are. They're too ignorant to know that they're ignorant. But having high intelligence or being better educated has no bearing on protecting people from their prejudices and cognitive biases. We humans are very bad at finding evidence against our views. It's called motivated reasoning or confirmation bias, and we all have it, and I certainly have it in spades. We believe that we possess the truth, and we mostly listen to evidence that confirms our views, and we ignore or deny evidence against our views. Most behavior is driven by unconscious cognitive biases and emotions, not rational thinking, as much as we'd like to believe otherwise. Simply not the case. And we see them voting. These are just a few examples of how our brain performs poorer than we'd like to believe. There's thousands of studies showing how our brains can be primed and manipulated to unconsciously make us behave in ways we are unaware of. V.S. Ramachandran is a neuroscientist at UC San Diego, and he's written several popular science books, including A Brief Tour of Human Consciousness. And on the very first page of that book, he says, your conscious life, in short, is nothing but an elaborate post hoc rationalization of things you do for other reasons. Post hoc means after the fact. What he's saying is most of our cognitive working memory, or the way that we come to make decisions and drive our motivation and actions, is unconscious. When some of that is promoted to consciousness, we don't really know why, but we rationalize it after the fact. We actually make up a story to tell ourselves, this is why I'm doing this. And he's saying that's not it. You're making up reasons, but you're really doing it for other reasons that you're not aware of. And this is where I revisit the function of human beliefs. I said beliefs are a feature of human cognition, and religious beliefs are a subset. What is the function of beliefs? It's to simplify and relieve our cognitive load. Whether 60,000 years ago or today, life is far too complicated and overwhelming for our evolved cognition. Evolution gave humans this new consciousness to be able to conceive concepts and ideas, to create culture, but there's way too much information bombarding us to constantly figure out everything in the moment. And anyway, rational consciousness is far too slow to handle real-time events. Beliefs offload the burden of always having to figure everything out, to make decisions every step of the way. Beliefs are stand-ins for reality. And it doesn't matter if beliefs are true or false. Most of the time, we humans can't tell the difference anyway. The human ability to ask the existential questions, why we exist, what's our purpose in life, why we die, all that stuff. The ability to ask these questions is enabled by our evolved brain, but evolution didn't give us the cognitive skills to answer them to the same degree. I use the analogy of a balance scale. Take all the questions that we are able to ask, it's very heavy. Take our ability to answer those questions, not so much. It's very uneven. The unevenness highlights the weaknesses in our so-called rational thinking mind. But evolution, we always want to know the answers, so evolution gave us the cognition to create beliefs like gods and mythologies to provide answers, in air quotes. So religious beliefs developed as a special case of rationalizations to answer questions that humans can't otherwise answer. But the basic point of beliefs is that they're a cognitive shortcut, almost a crutch, if you will, to relieve working memory. It's another example of how we solve the inner conflicts and turmoil between our unconscious and our consciousness. I'm going to give you one more example of the struggle, the conflict between consciousness and our unconscious. And that's flow versus consciousness. Who knows what flow is in this context? A few of you, great. Athletes, musicians, dancers, for example, and others describe that when they perform at their highest level as being in a state of flow. In a state of flow, you're acting without thinking. Musicians, you've seen people play the piano, their fingers are flying, or the guitar, their fingers are flying. They can't think about that. It's all got to be muscle memory. It's got to be memorization. If you think, do we have any musicians in here who perform? If you think about it, what happens?
That's when I start stuttering.
You screw up. No thinking. We perform better in many cases. Advisedly, we can't say all, but you can't think to be at your best. You have to turn off that noisy internal dialogue, which will just get in your way. Of course, practice and learning require conscious effort. But to get really good, you then need to shut it off. Performers choke when thinking gets in the way. Stage fright is an example of choking under pressure. People can underperform because of expectations enabled by consciousness. There's no actual danger confronting a performer, in general. Embarrassment is not dangerous. But that's an instance of where we're bad at estimating risk. And there's a whole study of, many studies of how people are bad at estimating risk. This is why they do stupid things. Some of you, many of you here, are old enough to remember the character Stuart Smalley on Saturday Night Live, right? Played by Al Franken. He had a mantra. He said, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. And why did he say that? Because he was afraid he wasn't good enough, he was afraid he wasn't smart enough, and he didn't think people liked him. And what ended up happening in the skit is he'd start his mind going around and around. He'd start doing what he called stinking thinking. He'd tell himself, stop the stinking thinking, but he would just do it anyway. And we all laughed because we all recognized that we do those things too. There's many more ways that thinking, self-aware consciousness is a problem. I believe it interferes with human evolutionary fitness. Next postulate, human self-aware consciousness has downsides and drawbacks that must be ameliorated, lessened, and reduced. We started the second part of this talk with the scientific method, mostly observation. We looked at some of the scientific literature, again at a very high summarized level, related to our observations of religious ritual to add more evidence and context. Now we're going to summarize what we've been talking about. Consciousness has drawbacks. It's noisy, persistent, and distracting, looping and repetitive. We can be self-critical and judgmental, that little parental voice in our heads. No, you're not good enough. We're poor at reasoning in general. And consciousness is not the same as working memory, which is generally unconscious in its mechanism. And then before that we had talked about religious rituals. It swamps working memory, lowers anxiety levels, and suppresses unwanted or intrusive thoughts. Between these two groups, do you see a relationship? Perhaps. Yeah, kind of, maybe. Most people today assume that the original functions of religious rituals are no longer valid in our secular society, but we might need to rethink that. It also means we might need to reconsider our understanding of what religion is as well, if religion is based on our rituals. Participation in secular versions of what were once religious rituals still serve the same religious functions that they served in the past. They still inhibit thinking, awareness, consciousness temporarily, like meditation and yoga, but many other things as well. All other aspects of religion are built on top of this basic premise that religious rituals serve to suppress thinking, awareness, consciousness. So now we get to the second part of the scientific method, hypothesis. The personal experience of religion through acts of religious ritual is a compensating mechanism for the drawbacks of higher order consciousness, in other words, advanced human cognition. This is the thesis of my book. Higher order consciousness is as much of a problem as it is a benefit. Religious behaviors, rituals, are evolved adaptations that temporarily inhibit consciousness and provide relief from its drawbacks. Most of you this is new information. As I said, it's a new paradigm. It's unlike your understanding of the origin and function of religion. These ideas can be uncomfortable when you spend a good portion of your life looking at religion in a different way. And that's to be expected because you're human, most of you. But it takes this kind of paradigm shift to break through the impasse, the gridlock in the CSR community where they can't figure out, they can't agree on what it's about. It's tough because it suggests that you are in fact practicing religion when you enjoy music, whether you make music, whether you listen to music, when you enjoy and listen to art, whether you enjoy to dance, when you go to the movies and read a book, fiction at least, those are kind of mythologies. Those are stories of humans, which is what mythologies are about. They're telling, a good book and a good movie is telling us about the human condition, which is all that those mythologies generally were doing as well. If you're so motivated, you can read the first chapter of my book online at Darwin's Apple. At darwinsapple.com to see it presented in a slightly different approach, but it says the same things. And of course, you can buy the book. Lastly, I have references for all the papers that I cite in this talk, if you're interested. Thank you very much for your attention.
Is this on?
Well,
Would you
that
like
way.
the lights on for that?
No, it's fine right there.
Okay.
Okay,
You can turn the lights on.
questions?
I can.
Somebody, you want to beat me up on this. I know you can't be happy with this.
Yeah, I mean, you go ahead and turn the lights on if you want to. I can adjust the camera's exposure from here.
Come on, Andy.
Oh,
I've got it wired.
Okay,
Yeah,
fine.
come to.
Oh, the mic, I have to be on it.
Yeah. Well,
Put on a mask, they won't recognize you.
Oh, I wasn't supposed to say that. So I was laughing at several points during this because you've actually fairly neatly encapsulated my theory of minor league baseball as atheist church.
Yes,
And-
absolutely.
And it has to do with when leaving a religious institution, you leave behind ritual, which people need. It's sort of a function that, that goes missing. And minor league baseball has everybody there for the same purpose, for the same reason, at the same time, all doing the same thing, all paying attention to the same stuff, call and response. And everybody has their, well, maybe on one half of the stadium and the other half of the stadium, they're all there hoping for the same goal.
Right.
With the added benefit of beer. So that has long been my theory of minor league baseball as atheist church.
Can we say that all professional sports are somewhat like that?
Yeah, yeah.
but baseball's the only one, right? Isn't
Well,
that
for
how it
me,
works?
yeah.
Or is the correct one?
No, other people have actually said that sports has a religious feel to it, the way that people get emotionally involved in it and kind of worship their teams. I mean,
But the catharsis and the ecstasy part, like when you mentioned the glossolalia,
That's right.
and the whirling dervish, that is
That's right.
that is an altered state, that is an ecstasy form. Religion, certain things have an ecstatic. I mean, not religion, music. Certain things have an ecstatic quality to them.
Absolutely.
Certainly, things like if you see the charismatics, they'll do the laughing bit. Or the spontaneous jump. That's all sort of a state of ecstasy, and I
Right.
think that follows to your point about swamping
work in memory, yeah.
So,
Absolutely. No, thank you for pointing that out. People get
Any chat questions?
people get very emotional about their sports teams, and I would venture to say, could we say a slight altered state of consciousness, or at least their general consciousness is changed because they're focused on the event. They're not thinking here so much. They're thinking about what's going on out there.
there's also external effects after a big win or a big loss.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Either
Also
you're-
the branding and carrying the visuals.
the symbolism, the art.
Symbolism, wearing it,
You know,
putting it on the car.
during one of the postulates, there was a picture of a bunch of tribesmen, and I forgot to mention that if you remember, they were adorned. They had things in their nose and things here, and they had headdresses and all kinds of stuff. And that's all the art. And that's also part of the symbolism of identification. I'm this tribe because that other tribe has slightly different ornamentation, so I can tell the difference. Who's Lawrence of Arabia movie fan by any chance? You've seen it. Well, it's one of my favorite movies, and there's a part in it where Lawrence, interesting, has been given a gift of a robe, of the Arab Bedouin robe from the people he's with. And he's actually walking out by himself in the desert, and he's kind of admiring himself. And suddenly, down the sand dune comes a kid, literally like a preteen on a horse, a boy. And he's got a rifle, and he does this to Lawrence, and Lawrence goes like this. And then the next horse comes by, and it's the kid's dad, who happens to be the tribal leader, Anthony Quinn. And Anthony asks his son, "What kind of man is this?" And the kid says, "English." "What kind of robe is he wearing?" And the kid names the tribe of the gown that he's wearing. Because they always adorn themselves with the various symbols that you're talking about being different than the others for identity and social cohesion, actually.
Your phone light is on. It's dying back.
Oh, Thank you. Got enough to make it to the car.
Do we have any more questions? Oh, John, come. And I'll have one too as well, but I want to get you guys first. No, go ahead.
So you made mention about some historical information on when religion had started.
Correct.
So at what point would you say we have solid evidence, not for ritual, because there seems to be a lot of blurring between ritual and religion here, that we can say religion is something more than just paintings, but something in the persistence of specific rituals or some other power that's having control over them, or they feel is having control. What point in history would you say we could push back to and say, this is where we can say we actually have good evidence for religion?
Well, so I said that rituals are the behaviors of religion, and that's where I start. Now, it sounds like you're asking about beliefs, like the powers, the gods kind of thing, or, I mean...
Well, if we're going to say that that this is based on the reason that we have these things is that it is a factor in our fitness.
Yes.
What date do we say that became a factor in our fitness?
Well, the assumption is if ritual arose for that purpose, to suppress temporarily consciousness, then that's acting as a way of helping fitness. Because, so one thing I didn't say quite out loud, because it also bothers people, is that because we're animals, I did say that we're not clear of instinct, we're just less reliant on it. But our behaviors that are adaptive, that enable us to survive and reproduce, are still basically unconscious. They're driven by our inherited neurophysiology, our hormones, and all these things. The point is, when consciousness started getting busy enough in our head, it was starting to detract or distract from the inside unconscious forces that enable us to survive and reproduce, to be evolutionarily adaptive and successful. At that point, these mechanisms, these religious rituals started to arise. And so our best guess is 100,000 years ago, roughly, that we started having mechanisms that caused us, these rituals, to suppress that conscious noise in our head a little bit on occasion. And of course, in those cultures, we believe that those rituals and religious thought was much more prevalent than it is today in our secular society. So for them, say 100,000 years ago is roughly when I'm going with, based on as much evidence as I have observed in the scientific literature.
But the idea is that through that, we've become evolutionarily more fit?
No. I mean, you don't, that's just a poor way of putting it, because, well, how would we say it? Well, I'm not sure I can answer that question exactly the way you phrased it. Evolution is always a compromise. Every feature tends to have a benefit and a downside to it, right? And so if we develop something like ritual that helps us be more fit in one sense, what it's doing is it's offsetting the downsides of consciousness. But consciousness is very important. Consciousness is huge to how we became as successful as we have. So that's the way I look at it. But in terms of us making us more fit, if we didn't have it, I don't know. So I said what I believe in the thesis of my book about the compensating mechanism for higher order consciousness is a hypothesis. Mm-hmm. To go to the next step, you have to create experimentation. So and I've been thinking about what kind of experiments you could do to test for what ritual does to suppress thinking consciousness. And how could you measure? I mean, we see that it working memory, and we see that it suppresses intrusive thoughts. But does that, you need to be able to measure that in some way to say, how is that good or bad?
So is that the extent of the hypothesis and not that it affects our fitness?
Well, I said I believe it affects our fitness, is what I said. It's certainly something that needs to be debated, but you need to have the hypothesis to start with the experimentation. In order to create an experimental design, you need to have an hypothesis to start with, to try and create something to show whether the hypothesis is confirmed or not.
So my question is kind of on a mechanical portion of this, that evolutionary time, even over 100,000 years, is extremely fast, right?
Yes.
The difference between how long humans as we recognize them exist is over millions of years.
Correct.
And those rituals and things have existed for far longer than that.
What? Which rituals?
From just 100,000 years ago, right? We're saying that, oh, maybe religion as an organized practice, series of events is 100,000 years old.
Right.
But humans, as we would recognize them, have existed for far longer and would have had rituals beyond that, beyond religion. They would have had things that they do on a consistent basis.
The profane or mundane rituals.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. So if we're saying that at some point the addition of religion made us more fit, you'd be very hard pressed to try to see that in a 100,000-year timeline, is what I'm trying to express. So, and the fact that you wouldn't have an additional competitor in our sphere to force us one direction or another, right? There's no near human analog that would be pushing us out of our fitness in our environment.
We're not competing with another Homo.
Yes.
To
At this stage, at 100,000 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, actually, at that point, there was Neanderthal.
At 100,000 years?
Well, they went extinct, we believe, about 40,000 years ago.
Okay.
So they were around, and in fact, as you know, we all have a little, especially all you Europeans here, have
Some more than others.
Yes, have Neanderthal genes in you.
One other question is that you didn't mention that another hypothesis or theory for having religion and a culture is a way to set laws and social norms to strengthen the way that a society works.
That's true. I did not say that. That's kind of advanced culturally. Say that again. What were the categories?
Well, because there were some different ideas on what you postulated as to why we would have religion.
Yeah.
And one that was not brought up as a possibility for having religion is the idea of needing laws and social norms to have society.
So when I think about hunter-gatherers, norms and laws, I mean, laws didn't exist in hunter-gatherers per se because nothing was formalized. I mean, you pretty much were raised to know how you were supposed to behave. Those were the norms. And some of them were, you know, how do you hunt and how do you make the baskets and all these things. Some of them were, what do you believe or what you're supposed to believe, that there are these forces, these powers. And so that all came through the mythology pretty much. So, it sounds like some of the things you're talking about are really in more modern situations, post-agriculture and all that.
Well, I mean, if you're going to have a society and have to work with other people, social norms are required.
Right.
It's just, this is another theory that's thrown out there as the reason why religion exists, is to have a lawful society.
Right.
Even if before advanced forms of law, you have to have some basics understood in order for a group of people to reside in the same place.
I've read a number of books about what were fairly, primitive is the wrong word, but say pre-literate tribes where the anthropologists go out and they write a book about their observations. And, you know, I've had, like some people, this sort of ideal idealized vision of what these tribes are like, and that they all get along and they all cooperate, and of course it's not like that at all. There are people like we are, and they have jealousies, and they get into fights with each other, and they get pissed because the rule is that when the hunter goes and he kills something and brings it back, there's a hierarchy of how that meat is distributed, and someone will say, you didn't follow the hierarchy and I didn't get enough of the meat. So they have those norms, issues, and they quibble about it. And sometimes they get rather heated, and they have, we talk about how humans are serial monogamists. Well, some of them were more than serial monogamists, and there was one book in particular where this female anthropologist interviewed this 50-year-old woman, and that was pretty much the whole book was her testimony. And she talked about the 3 husbands she had, and she alluded to in a rather obtuse way about the sexual stuff that was involved in that. And it's like, yeah, I mean, this is real life. And it's not easy, and it's complicated, and she was unhappy about some of the stuff that went on with her husbands. And there was the one husband that she liked the best, he died. And the other 2, she wasn't as crazy about, but what are you gonna do? And one of the things that, just as an aside, which is not quite what you're talking about, that just blew me away is, people were dying all the time. And you knew they were dying from stuff that today is like nothing. You get a shot of penicillin or antibiotic and you're done, it's fine. And it's like, oh my God, we think about how, these cultures were in tune with the earth, that they knew the behavior of the animals and they knew what every plant, with medicine or food or poison or whatever. And they died at their life expectancy was so different. They didn't know how to deal with all the little lung diseases, the little common colds or flus that they would get. We didn't know what they were because, all they saw was someone start having a cold and the next thing they were dead.
Yeah.
And they weren't that old.
Having a religion and a belief system allows you to feel that you have some power over a heavily random world, right?
That's right, absolutely.
Especially if you don't understand germ theory and how to help people that need help, you can at least think in your own mind you have some power over this. So societies, especially like fishing societies and things like that have to go out onto a random ocean and may never return, have a lot of those early types of systems of beliefs that they think they have some control over what happens on the water.
And before they went out on their fishing trips on the ocean, they had rituals to ask the god not to kill them on the ocean.
Well, overall, thank you very much. I appreciate you spending the time to help educate, and I did an excellent job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, any more questions? Oh, Tom, come on over. And I know we're probably, so if there is any other question, come over and line up behind him. That way we could say our goodbyes, because I know you guys want some more food.
I wanted to ask you, when you mentioned about speaking in tongues, about 30 years ago I was in Japan working, and a colleague of mine invited me to go to his church, and I just was being respectful. I said, I'll go to church with him, because we were going to go to dinner afterwards. And I said, so when the ceremony, when it was going on, all of a sudden the speaking in tongues started, and I.
What kind of church? Was it Christian?
It was a Christian, yeah, Christian church. He's American. His parents are missionaries in the Philippines and that area, Japan as well. And it was mostly, there was a few Americans, but there was a lot of Japanese people in the crowd. But all of a sudden, the speaking in tongues started, and I just was I didn't anticipate it happening, and all of a sudden it's going on, and everybody's doing it, and I can hear it in English and Japanese, which really kind of got me going. I was like, because I could understand some Japanese, but then I was thinking, I just decided to myself, oh, I'm going to do this too. And I just started making up sounds. And I thought, well, maybe that's what they're doing. So I don't quite, how, is there some kind of evolution or how that came about? Where how people just all of a sudden started doing that, and what it means to them? And
well, I don't know about evolution. I mean, what you do have is altered states of consciousness, and that was one of the examples. So how is it that we are so susceptible under the right circumstances, to have an altered state of consciousness experience? Well, usually there's something going on, and I can't speak to the... I suppose if you're already a Christian, you might be more susceptible. You've been primed and trained to expect it. But, you know, the easiest way, you know, psychedelics is altered states of consciousness on demand. But in all these different religious traditions, another way is sacrifice, where you're actually hurting yourself, wearing the cloth. What's the cloth that?
Yeah, the hair suit.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And you know, whipping yourself for having dirty thoughts or whatever. You know, and some of them, you know, are very brutal. And of course, the dancing or the movement, the rites of passage, where they. I mean, has anybody read some of the descriptions of rites of passage for the adolescent boys? I mean, they're really brutal. So one of my favorite, of course, is the Aborigines of Australia, where they perform a sub-incision on the boy's penis, if you haven't heard of that. Where they actually cut a slice out of the urethra underneath. Little, and that turns him into a man, apparently. And why did they do that? It traumatizes the boys, for damn sure. It alters their consciousness, and that's just, you know, an example. And then they go out on their dream walk, I guess, where they have to survive for I don't know how many days on their own. You know, of course they've been taught how to find water and to hunt and all that, but now they have to prove it as a man.
Thank you. Oh,
Is that enough information for you?
yeah. Well, I mean, is there any like kind of like when it started, or like
When what started?
like speaking in tongues and you know, like
Oh.
is it just is it
Oh, I
pretty
don't know.
recent? I mean,
That's a Christian thing.
Oh, okay.
I mean,
When Jerry DeWitt was here, I don't know if you guys remember him.
Oh, yeah, Jerry.
He described it as a self-induced ecstatic state. The term, the language, quote unquote, used doesn't actually mean anything. There's no structure to it, but it's a self-imposed ecstatic state. He's like, I'm an atheist now. I can still do this.
right. Well, thank you for pointing that out, because ecstasy and trance are also very big deals within you know, altered states of consciousness efforts that different cultures do.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay, so two things. Well, first, before I begin, I'm sorry that I was late. I really apologize. I really wanted to be here for the whole presentation.
It's
Okay,
all
yeah,
recorded,
okay, good. All right, we have the technology to do that. Thank you. That's reassuring. I'm sorry I got overwhelmed with the whole Tyree Nickel thing. I had blocked it out of my...
Oh, my
Yeah, I
goodness.
blocked it out of my head the last few days and then kind of addressed it because of the funeral and just overwhelmed me all. And I was delayed by all this stuff, dealing with it and arguing with conservative friends anyway. But yeah, so I had some thoughts about what he had said, but also a question as well. Thank you for this. And my thoughts were just when he was mentioning about the speaking in tongues and things like that, ecstatic. You know, I came out of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which was more of a conservative SDA church. My dad was a pastor. But when I was in college, I dated a woman who's Pentecostal. And I would go to her. It's kind of funny because we'd go to church on Saturday, my church. You know, there's Saturday church. And we'd go on Sunday again because her dad was a Pentecostal preacher. 2 days in. Crazy. But I went to Pentecostal churches and saw that kind of ecstatic thing, and it's really true, like what he was saying, how there's certain riffs you can play on the organ. You can play those riffs, and they will put you into a hypnotic trance. And, you know, dun 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 dun. You know, there's certain, and it'll work every time. You know, you get people in a certain, you know, mood, and you can, you know, alter, just like in a rock concert. You know, the Doors did it. You know, it's not, you know, it's not like rocket science. It's science. You know, you can alter people's, and you get them into a state where they think they're doing certain things. I remember I even opened myself up to it at a certain point, and I couldn't do it, but I opened myself up to it when I was broken down at a point. So, yeah, it can definitely work yourself up. But I was kind of curious, kind of like along the last guy's question, I saw a great video online called Sky Cake. It's a comedian, I can't think of his name. Thank you, Oswald. Yeah, Patton Oswald. Yeah, does Sky Cake. Where his whole thing was like, even though he's an atheist and he mocks religion mercilessly, but in a funny way. His whole point was that he's really grateful for religion because somebody told people who are just total barbarians, hey, if you act a little bit nicer toward each other now in the here and now, when you die, you're going to go up to heaven. You'll get sky cake. There'll be sky cake for you, and everybody loves cake, so. That was it. You convince that bully to be less horrible. He's simplifying it. It's humor, but it's kind of a thing that it seems like it makes sense that once you can kind of create structures of control, is that part of how? And I didn't hear the whole presentation how it happens, and then you can kind of set up a society based on that.
That's kind of where I'm going to answer you is to say
an afterlife, like we can control you now and afterlife. Right.
So I talked about how the very early burials, and we're talking 60,000, maybe 70,000 years ago, they find the tributes in the burial, in the grave site, which we think is because the people had a concept of a soul that continued on after the person died. And that soul would go on to the next life. And depending on the culture, the next life has who knows what it meant to them compared to what we think it means today. Today, the Christians talk about heaven. And then the Muslims talk about other stuff. But the point is, at that time, they had this concept of an afterlife, which is a strong indication of having spirituality, of an early religious feeling. Now, I think you were also kind of talking about how the social cohesion thing works. And the other thing I said was that animals have social cohesion mechanisms as well. They have things like dominant hierarchy and territoriality. But they've also shown, scientists have shown, that at least some of the primates, and probably birds, have empathy and morality. And there's some interesting experiments, which you can probably see on YouTube, showing how, at least the one example I'm familiar with, is that they have two rhesus monkeys side by side in a cage, separate cages, but next to each other. And they've been trained that when they do a certain act, the trainer says, do this, whatever. And if they do it, they get a grape. If they don't do it right, they get a piece of cucumber. They'll eat the cucumber, but they don't like it as much as the grape. So what he does is he asks the monkey to do a thing. The monkey does it right. He gives it a cucumber instead of a grape. Both monkeys go crazy. You didn't reward me the way you're supposed to. The other monkey, who wasn't even involved, just watching, has a sense of morality, sense that that was wrong. You were supposed to give my buddy the grape, and you gave him the cucumber. Maybe it's empathy as well. So those are the examples that I know for showing these primates have these kind of what I call social cohesion mechanisms. I mean, those are part of what informs the bigger picture of a society, of a culture, in terms of social cohesion. So the point is, animals have it. And I claim, and I'm not unusual, this is pretty well known, that we inherited those same mechanisms. Humans have dominance hierarchy, there's no question. Humans have territoriality and empathy and morality and all these other things. So I think we already had that. And what we observe is we have in cultures, we create cultural manifestations of those things that are already inside us. like wearing the clothes that identify our group different from the other group. That doesn't create the social cohesion. That's a manifestation of the already internal social cohesion mechanisms that we inherited. It's flipped. They say religion improves social cohesion. What religion does is it enables us to manifest what we already have inside of us. So when we go into church and everybody's all hallelujah, it's a way to fulfill the social cohesion mechanism that they've already got. Because they need it. Because we all have it inside of us, we need to express it. It's like language. When we learn language, we learn the specific language, of course, that the culture that we're brought up in. But we already have the brain structures inside us that control how language works. We have the Wernicke's area and the Brokaw's area and these other things. And of course, if they get damaged, as it sometimes happens, and they have these examples of people, they lose the ability to talk, to understand maybe. It's called an aphasia, and there's lots of different kinds of aphasias. It's already in us. We just need the opportunity to express it. And children do that just by growing up. The brain matures to a point. The interaction with adults and kids around them, then they start to be able to talk. They're not conscious of it. They're not learning in class, this word, this word, this word. It's automatic, based on the fact that their brain is primed, it's ready. Just get to a point where I can actually do this. I can form the words with my mouth. I can understand the words I'm hearing. I can respond. You know, babies mimic the adults. You know, the mother's going, oh, whoa, 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 and the kid's going, right? Or you stick out your tongue to the kid will stick his tongue out back. And that's a baby who's way before talking. It's all in there, but it takes time to develop, and it will.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were done.
Oh, no, it's fine.
Don't wait until one talk is over and then I figure it out.
Oh, okay.
He was done.
No,
I mean, I go on too long, I'm sorry.
You looked at me, so I thought I was looking at you.
No.
Okay, thank you for giving the talk, first of all. I actually have your book at home on my shelf, but I have not read it yet. So
Wow.
It's possible that if I read it, it'll answer my question. But so you started the talk and you kind of said, who wants religion to go away, and then you said you're probably not going to be very happy with the direction of this talk.
Right.
You gave some examples of sacred rituals, including music and art and other sacred rituals. And then you talked about religious rituals as having sort of the same benefits, if we want to phrase it that way, the calming of the noisy consciousness. I would say I'd probably speak for more than just myself if I said that most of us are pretty happy with a lot of those sacred rituals, art and music and dance, for example. And you sort of used those interchangeably. You even said, I think, when we listen to music, we're practicing religion. I think you used something similar to that. So I guess I would almost say, rather than being disappointed with the direction of this talk, that almost seems to imply, well, since these are all interchangeable and have the same benefits, maybe we could get rid of some of the baggage that comes with the supernatural and the formalized religion. So I guess it's sort of asking for speculation, but I wondered, do you think these are interchangeable, or do you have a different set of thoughts about certain sacred rituals versus others and the role they fulfill?
Well, the ones I mentioned them because they all have benefit. The mythology, art, prayer. I mean, I think there's such a thing as prayer therapy, but I haven't really looked into it. Well, I'm sure that the religious groups have their own versions of therapies where they use, religious ritual as a basis to get there. So for those, yes. I mean, they are all beneficial. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
I guess with the implication that we wouldn't be happy where the talk was going, I wonder if you think there's a reason specifically that religious sacred rituals are going to stick around as opposed to other sacred rituals that we may not object to as humanists.
Like, for instance?
Like music or art.
I'm confused.
I think he talked about those things more as specific manifestations, of general manifestations, as opposed to specific manifestations.
Let me ask
like,
it this way.
don't
Why
do
do you
stuff.
think that we would not be happy with the direction that the talk is going? Why do you
Well, it's
imply
just that I'm in this free thought group. I'm an atheist. When I tell people that they practice religion through those rituals, it just takes them back. It's like, what are you talking about? Because they think of religion as church. They think of religion as doctrine. And, well, that's true. But I said, when I talk about the origins of religion, we're not talking about that stuff. But in our society today, that is what religion is. So they don't want to hear that beliefs in gods, beliefs in mythologies, that doesn't work. But then what I tell them is, you're thinking about it wrong, because mythologies is more than the gods throwing lightning bolts down on us. Mythologies are about telling the stories, the stories of humanity. What is a mythology really? It's about the behaviors of people, and it's like a fictional story, the human condition. So it's just a different way of looking at it. And I don't care about organized religion. I don't care about institutional religion. It's a problem. But we have all these other things that we do that are religious-like as well. So it's just a different way of thinking about what religion is. So, but it's a tough one, because in our society, there is this big institutional religion thing that's trying to impose itself in our government. That's bad. But there's this other part of religion that we all do every day anyway, and that's different. So it's just a matter of trying to line up the differences in what matters.
That makes sense. We're going to be not happy where the talk is going because of the realignment of definitions rather than the implication that organized religion is not going away. I see where I misunderstood.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
A new word for these rituals other than religious rituals.
Semantics is tough. These guys like Ramachandran named his book A Brief Tour of Human Consciousness. Consciousness is a terrible word. Just what the hell does that mean?
I'm glad we ended it with that, because Drew said the question more eloquently than I could have, but that's exactly what I was thinking the whole time. Is that we got rid of a lot of other rituals that we don't partake in anymore, and some are very barbaric still that we fight against. So like everything else, we kind of use our brains, like words, to know that you could still be moral and ethical and enjoy music without having to believe in having sky cake at the end of our lives. But thank you for the talk. It was wonderful, and I have some parting gifts for the speaker and for our recorder.
Yay!